Hello, sleep detectives. Welcome back.
Most of the cases we cover, even the darkest, are about an end. They are about the hunt for an assailant, the discovery of a tragic truth, and the final, somber act of justice. But tonight, we are covering a case that is not about an end. It is about a process. It is about the psychology of survival, minute by agonizing minute. We are traveling to the high desert of New Mexico, to a place called Elephant Butte. Here, one man built a custom, soundproof trailer, a mobile prison he called his toy box. And for decades, he operated with impunity, until one victim, with unimaginable courage, did the impossible. This is the story of David Parker Ray, and the psychological investigation into the mind of a survivor. I love knowing where our community is. It's a comfort to think of us as a group of curious minds, all settling in from different parts of the world to explore these complex stories together. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from this evening. The year is 1999. The town is Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. It's a small, dusty community on the edge of the sprawling Elephant Butte Reservoir, a place where people come to escape, to retire, or to disappear. Our normal world centers on 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil. She was a woman living on the fringes, struggling with addiction and working in the sex trade in nearby Albuquerque. Her life was precarious, a day-to-day survival. On March 22, 1999, Cynthia was in Albuquerque looking for her next client. A man pulled up. He seemed average, unassuming. He introduced himself as Dave. He was older, in his late 50s, with a disarming, neighborly demeanor. He offered Cynthia $100 to accompany him back to his place. This was a routine transaction in a high-risk world. Cynthia agreed, got in his car, and they began the drive south, toward Truth or Consequences. For a time, the interaction was normal. They chatted. But as they drove further into the remote, empty desert, the man's demeanor shifted. He pulled out a badge and identified himself as an undercover police officer. He told Cynthia she was under arrest for solicitation. In that moment, Cynthia's world fractured. She was now in the complete control of a man she did not know, in the middle of nowhere, with the threat of the law, or something posing as it, hanging over her. The man was David Parker Ray. He was not a police officer. He was a 59-year-old mechanic, a former Army serviceman, and a well-known, if eccentric, member of the local community. He was a man who, on the surface, seemed like just another desert character. But in reality, Ray was perhaps the most organized, patient, and psychologically sadistic predator in modern American history. He drove Cynthia not to a police station, but to his home, a nondescript trailer in the middle of the desert. He informed her that he had to process her before taking her to jail. He led her from his home into a second, larger trailer parked nearby. It was a large, white, refrigerated semi-trailer. It looked like a simple storage unit. He opened the heavy, insulated door. Inside, it was dark. This is the moment the fracture completes. This is the moment Cynthia Vigil leaves the normal world and enters David Parker Ray's. He shoves her inside. The heavy door seals with a pneumatic hiss, plunging the room into absolute, soundproof blackness. She is no longer in the New Mexico desert. She is in the toy box. This is the dual reality. From the outside, it is a white, windowless trailer. Inside, it is a custom-built psychological torture chamber. As Cynthia's eyes adjust to the dim light, she sees that this is not a storage unit. It is a room. It is carpeted. It is lined with medical diagrams of the human anatomy. And it is filled with tools. The walls are lined with a truly horrifying arsenal of implements: whips, chains, clamps, saws, and surgical tools. In the center of the room is a custom-built table equipped with gynecological stirrups. In the corner, a complex system of pulleys and restraints. This is not a room. This is an operating theater for a fantasy. And then, as Cynthia is trying to process this visual horror, the A-plot, the world of the perpetrator, asserts itself. A television screen flickers on. This is psychological seed number 1. David Parker Ray does not speak. Instead, he plays a pre-recorded audio tape. It is his voice, calm, methodical, and devoid of emotion, like a pre-flight safety briefing. The voice on the tape welcomes her. It informs her that she is now his slave. It explains the rules of the toy box. The voice explains in chilling, clinical detail what is about to happen to her. It tells her that her old life is over, that she will be trained, that she will be subjected to a series of torments, both physical and psychological. It tells her that her hearing and sight will be played with. It tells her that she may be shared with his friends. And it tells her, most importantly, that no one has ever escaped. It tells her that if she complies, she might eventually be sold into slavery. If she does not comply, she will be disposed of, and her body will never be found. This is the psychological checkmate. Ray is not just a brute. He is a scriptwriter. He is scripting the entire experience. He is removing all human interaction from the initial terror. He is replacing it with a cold, recorded, official set of rules. He is, in effect, rebooting his victim's psyche. He is erasing her identity and replacing it with a new one: slave. For the next 3 days, Cynthia Vigil lives inside this scripted nightmare. The B-plot, the victim's reality, is a blur of disorientation and survival. Ray is not alone. He has accomplices. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, actively participates. His daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, and even a friend, Dennis Roy Yancey, are involved. This is not the act of one lone wolf. This is a team, a family of predators, which makes the psychological control even more complete. Cynthia is subjected to exactly what the tape promised. She is restrained, assaulted, and systematically dehumanized. But in the midst of this, her mind is working. She is not just a victim, she is a survivor. She realizes very quickly that physical resistance is futile. She is chained, and they are many. So she deploys the only weapon she has: psychological compliance. She listens, she obeys, she makes herself useful. She tries to form a bond, however perverse, with her captors. She memorizes names she hears. She memorizes details of the toy box. She is, in effect, conducting her own forensic investigation while being held captive. This brings us to the second baffling psychological seed. This is psychological seed number 2. On the third day, March 24th, 1999, Cynthia is chained by the neck with a heavy collar and padlock. Her captor, Cindy Hendy, is in the toy box with her. Hendy is distracted, preparing a syringe. In this moment, Hendy makes a mistake. She fumbles the keys to the padlock. They fall to the floor near Cynthia. Hendy, annoyed, leaves the trailer to get something, believing Cynthia to be secure. Cynthia is now alone. The keys to her collar are within reach. She manages to retrieve them. She finds the key that fits the padlock. She unlocks the collar. She is free. This is the moment of escape. This is the breakthrough. But Cynthia Vigil does nothing. She does not run. She does not scream. She does not try to break down the door. She hears Hendy returning. And in a split second, C. Vigil puts the collar back on and locks it. She slides the keys back to where they fell. Why? From the outside, this is baffling. It seems like a failure, a moment of weakness. But from the professor lens of survival psychology, this is an act of pure, cold-blooded genius. Cynthia's compliant mind is working. She knows she is in a soundproof trailer in the middle of the desert. She knows there are multiple captors. If she escapes the collar, Hendy will return, and the illusion of her compliance will be shattered. They will know she is a fighter. They will double the restraints. They will, perhaps, enact the final punishment the tape promised. She realizes that freedom from the collar is not freedom from the toy box. She sacrifices her immediate physical freedom in exchange for maintaining her psychological advantage. They still believe she is a compliant, broken slave. She is waiting for the right moment. This is the brick wall of the A-plot. The police, for decades, have been hunting a killer, but they have no bodies. This is psychological seed number 3. David Parker Ray, on his tapes and in his journals, brags about decades of training and about disposing of dozens of victims. And yet, despite the most intensive search in New Mexico history, authorities have never found a single human remain connected to him. Is this the sign of a perfect predator? A meticulous master who knows how to dispose of all evidence? Or is this the sign of a pathological narcissist? Is the true horror of the toy box not slaying, but psychological breaking? Is it possible that the disposal was just talk? Was Ray a killer, or was he a braggart? A man whose entire twisted fantasy was not about the end, but about the process? The toy box was not a kill room, it was a theater. And for 3 days, Cynthia Vigil was its unwilling star, waiting in the wings for her one true moment to escape. Cynthia Vigil's calculation, her decision to feign compliance and wait, was a profound psychological gamble. It was a bet that her captor's arrogance would eventually create a real opportunity. She did not have to wait long. The breakthrough moment arrived later that same day. David Parker Ray decided it was time to move his slave to the next phase of her training. He and Cindy Hendy entered the toy box. They unhooked Cynthia from the restraints in the trailer. She was still wearing the heavy collar and chains, but she was now mobile. Their intention was to move her from the trailer into Ray's house. This was the mistake her survival instinct had been waiting for. She was no longer in a soundproof, sealed metal box. She was, for a fleeting moment, outside in the open air of the desert. She was still compliant. She walked with them passively toward the house. Ray entered the house first, holding the end of her chain, preparing to secure her inside. Hendy was behind her. In this split second, Cynthia acted. She was not, as they believed, a broken slave. She was a survivor. She lunged, not at Ray, but at Hendy. She grabbed Hendy by the throat, using her as a shield. Ray, stunned, was pulled off balance. Cynthia slammed Hendy's head against the side of the trailer. And then she ran. She ran as she had never run in her life. She was wearing only the heavy metal slave collar and a pair of white socks. She was running, barefoot, through the jagged, thorny New Mexico desert, the heavy chain from the collar still attached, whipping against her back. Ray and Hendy, shocked, began to chase her. This is the reemergence. Cynthia ran toward the only sign of civilization she could see, a neighboring house. She pounded on the door. A woman, a neighbor of Ray's, opened the door and was confronted with a vision from a nightmare. A young, terrified, half-clothed woman wearing a medieval-looking torture device, begging for help. The woman, in a panic, slammed the door in her face. Cynthia, her last hope apparently gone, did not give up. She kept running. She ran back toward the main road. She saw her pursuers. She saw Ray trying to get into his car to cut her off. She flagged down a passing truck. The driver, seeing the scene, seeing the collar, slammed on his brakes. She jumped in, screaming, "Drive! He's going to kill me!" The driver sped off, taking her to the nearest police station. The B plot, the family/survivor's emotional reunion, was, in this case, a reunion with society. When Cynthia Vigil stumbled into the Truth or Consequences police station, the officers on duty were confronted with a story they could barely comprehend. Her story was, frankly, insane. A soundproof toy box, a tape-recorded welcome, surgical tools, multiple accomplices. This was the stuff of a horror movie, not a police report in a sleepy desert town. For a moment, the police were skeptical, and then they looked at the evidence. They looked at the 25-pound, homemade, forged iron collar that was still padlocked to her neck. This was not a story. This was real. This is the bridge, the tension release. The long nightmare is over. The A-plot of the perpetrator's world is about to collapse. Based on Cynthia's testimony, a SWAT team was immediately assembled. They descended on David Parker Ray's trailer. They found the toy box, and it was exactly as she had described. It was the theater of horrors. The medical charts, the whips, the chains, the gynecological table with the stirrups, the complex pulley systems. And, most importantly, they found the tape, the welcome tape, the very one Ray had played for Cynthia, the one that detailed all his rules. David Parker Ray was arrested. His accomplices, Cindy Hendy, his daughter Jessie Ray, and Dennis Yancey were all subsequently captured. The toy box was sealed. The listeners and Cynthia could finally, physically relax. The what and who were solved. But the why, the psychology of how she survived, was the question that remained. Cynthia Vigil was free. David Parker Ray and his team were in custody. But the biggest question remained: how did she survive? And why, in that critical moment, did she not use the key? This is our USP. To understand, we must conduct a psychological autopsy, not just of the perpetrator, but of the survivor. We must apply the professor lens to the psychology of captivity. Payoff Seed 1: the psychology of the tape, the scripting. Let's begin with Ray's primary weapon, the audio tape. This is the signature of a highly organized and narcissistic perpetrator. Why use a tape? It's a dehumanization tool. By playing a tape, Ray remains a force, not a person. He is a narrator, not a participant. He is communicating that this is not a personal, emotional act. This is a process, a job. It makes him, in his mind, a professional. It's scripting. This is the core. Ray is a control-focused perpetrator. He has a precise, detailed fantasy in his mind. The tape is the script for that fantasy. He is forcing the victim to learn her role in his play. Psychological terror? The tape is designed to destroy hope. It methodically lists all the rules and punishments. It is a form of shock and awe for the psyche. It tells the victim, "I have thought of everything. There is no escape. I am God here." The tape is a tool to induce learned helplessness. It is designed to make the victim give up before the training even begins. Payoff Seed 2. The Psychology of Compliance. The Key. This brings us to Cynthia, the key, and the locked collar. This is the why hook. Why didn't she run? From the outside, it looks like weakness. From the professor lens, this is strategic compliance. Cynthia's mind, even in a state of terror, was performing a rapid, high-stakes cost-benefit analysis. Cost of action: I unlock the collar. I am free for 10 seconds. Hendy returns. She sees the open collar. She screams. Ray returns. They now see me as defiant. My compliant mask is gone. The script of the slave is broken. The real punishment, the disposal the tape warned about, begins. Benefit of inaction: I relock the collar. I slide the keys back. Hendy returns. She sees me, still compliant, still broken. The script is intact. They still trust me to be a victim. I am still alive. I have proven my compliance, and I can now wait for a better opportunity. This is not weakness. This is tactic. This is the opposite of learned helplessness. This is learned resourcefulness. She was actively profiling her captors. She understood that their primary psychological need was control. She gave them the control they craved in order to buy herself time. This is a profound, high-level survival strategy. She was, in that moment, playing David Parker Ray at his own scripted game. Payoff Seed 3. The Psychology of the Missing Bodies, the Narcissist. Finally, let's analyze the void of this case. Ray bragged about dozens of victims. His toy box was equipped for disposal, but no bodies were ever found. Why? Theory A: the perfect predator. Ray was exactly what he claimed to be. He was a master of disposal. He had decades. He used the vast, empty desert and the deep Elephant Butte Reservoir. He was, in this theory, the perfect serial killer. Theory B: the pathological narcissist. This theory is perhaps more psychologically sound. What if the true fantasy was not the end? What if it was the process? Ray's psychological payoff was the script. It was the training. It was the control. It was the fear he induced. Look at the evidence. He documented everything. He had journals. He had the tape. He had the tools. This is the profile of a man who is in love with his own performance as a master criminal. It is highly possible that the slaying was a failure of his fantasy. His goal was to break and sell his slaves. If he had to dispose of them, it meant his training had failed. It is very possible that Ray exaggerated his body count on his tapes and in his journals. Why? To increase the psychological terror on his current victim. The missing bodies are not a sign of his perfection. They are part of the script. They are the ghost stories he tells his new slaves to ensure their compliance. In this light, David Parker Ray was not a serial killer in the traditional sense. He was a serial torturer. And Cynthia Vigil, by understanding his need for control, was able to see the glitch in his script and use his own arrogance against him to escape the toy box. The escape of Cynthia Vigil did not just save her own life. It likely saved the lives of dozens of future victims. The A-plot, the system, now took over. David Parker Ray, 60, was charged, along with his 3 accomplices. The trial was a spectacle. The central evidence was the toy box itself and the chilling audio tape script. But the star witness was Cynthia Vigil. This is the B-plot, Life After. This was her final and most profound act of survival. She had to face her god, David Parker Ray, in court. Ray, the ultimate narcissist, represented himself for part of the proceedings. This meant he was able to personally cross-examine the woman who had escaped him. He was, in effect, trying to restart the script. But he was no longer in the toy box. He was in her world, the world of law, order, and consequences. Cynthia Vigil did not break. She calmly and in excruciating detail recounted the script he had written. She told the jury about the tape, the tools, and the torment. Her testimony was so powerful, so credible, that the master predator was broken. David Parker Ray was found guilty. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, took a plea deal in exchange for her testimony and received 36 years. His daughter, Jessie Ray, received 2.5 years for her role. The friend, Dennis Yancey, also received a 36-year sentence. The team was dismantled. The toy box was destroyed. The reflection on this case is one of profound human resilience. Cynthia Vigil was a woman on the fringes of society, a person whom Ray and his team saw as disposable, someone no one would miss. They were wrong. They mistook her for a character in their script. They failed to see her as a person. And it was that person, that survivor, who not only broke the script, but who found the strength to walk into a courtroom and narrate the true story, ensuring her God would never harm anyone again. The haunting echo of this case is not a quote from the killer, it is a quote from the survivor. Cynthia Vigil, when asked about her ordeal, said, "He had all the power, and I just took it away." David Parker Ray passed away in prison in 2002, just 1 year after his final conviction. He never revealed if there were other victims or where any bodies might be. He took his final script with him to the grave. Tonight, we travel to the ancient city of Xi'an, China. We are going to explore a tragedy that happened in the midst of the loudest, brightest celebration on Earth, the Lunar New Year. But while millions of people were celebrating outside, one woman was trapped in a silence so profound it defies imagination. This is the story of the elevator case and the psychological autopsy of 30 days in the dark. The date is January 30th, 2016. The city of Xi'an is buzzing with energy. The Lunar New Year, the Spring Festival, is approaching. It is a time of reunions, of red lanterns, and of noise. Our setting is the Gaoling Residential District, a sprawling complex of high-rise apartment buildings. It is a place of concrete and steel, home to thousands of families. In building number 12 lived a woman named Wu, identified in reports as Xiang Wei-yi. She was 43 years old. Wu was a solitary figure. She lived alone on the 15th floor. Her family said she had a history of mild mental health issues, which perhaps contributed to her isolated lifestyle. She kept to herself, a quiet resident in a noisy building. On this morning, January 30th, the elevator in Building 12 malfunctioned. It got stuck between the 10th and 11th floors. This is a common annoyance in high-rise living. The residents complained to the property management. The management called the maintenance company. 2 maintenance workers arrived at the scene. This is the fracture point, and it is defined not by malice, but by a chilling, fatal laziness. The workers stood on the 10th floor. They looked at the elevator doors. They did not have the tools, or perhaps the inclination, to force the doors open to visually check the cab. Instead, they did something that would seal a woman's fate. They shouted through the closed steel doors. "Is anyone inside?" They waited. Silence. Perhaps the insulation was too thick. Perhaps Wu was in a state of shock. Or perhaps, she shouted back, but her voice was drowned out by the ambient noise of the city preparing for the festival. Whatever the reason, the workers heard nothing. Satisfied, or perhaps just eager to start their own holiday break, they made a decision. They cut the power to the elevator. They placed a sign on the lobby door, "Under maintenance," and then they left. They did not just leave for the afternoon, they left for the holiday. The entire country was shutting down for the Lunar New Year. The workers went home to their families. The residents of Building 12 used the stairs or the second elevator. And inside the metal box, suspended in the dark shaft between the 10th and 11th floors, the power hummed down. The lights went out. The fan stopped spinning. Wu was alone. Outside, the world was exploding with light. The Lunar New Year is the loudest event in the Chinese calendar. Firecrackers, intended to scare away evil spirits, would have been banging day and night. Families were gathering for feasts. Inside the elevator, there was a void. We must use our psychological autopsy lens to reconstruct what happened in that box. There were no cameras. There were no witnesses. There is only the forensic evidence of the aftermath. Phase 1. The Panic. Days 1 through 3. In the beginning, there would have been hope. Wu likely shouted. She likely banged on the doors. We know this because of the forensic evidence found later. Her hands were mangled. But here is the tragedy of the B-plot. The noise outside was her enemy. The constant boom, boom, boom of the celebratory fireworks likely masked her screams. To a passerby on the stairs, a faint thud from the elevator shaft would have been swallowed by the cacophony of the festival. She was screaming into a hurricane of celebration. Phase 2. The Thirst. Days 4 to 7. The human body can survive weeks without food. It can only survive days without water. The elevator became a sensory deprivation tank. Pitch black, cold, the air growing stale. Psychologically, this is where the void takes over. Without visual stimuli, the brain begins to hallucinate. The darkness becomes heavy. But the physical need for water would have been the overriding torture. Forensic reports indicate there was no food or water in the elevator. We can only imagine the psychological desperation. Did she lick the condensation from the cold metal walls? Did she try to catch droplets? Phase 3. The resignation. The long wait. The holiday week ended. The fireworks stopped. The building returned to its normal rhythm. People were walking up and down the stairs, just feet away from her. But by now, after a week or more, Wu would have been too weak to scream. She would have been in a state of physiological shutdown. This is the psychological seed of the scene. When investigators later examined the interior of the cab, they found the door was marred by scratch marks, thousands of them. These were not just attempts to open the door. The steel was too strong. These were the marks of despair. She had spent her final days, or hours, scratching at the only barrier between her and the world. It was a slow, tactile record of her existence. She stripped the paint. She broke her nails. She deformed her own fingers. And then, silence. the residents of Building 12 began to notice something. A smell. But the systemic failure continued. People assumed it was garbage left over from the holiday, or perhaps a dead rat in the ventilation. No one checked the elevator. The sign still said, "Under maintenance." The void held its secret for 30 days. 30 sunrises, 30 sunsets. An entire month of a life slowly extinguishing in the dark, while the world outside moved on. March 1st, 2016. The Lunar New Year celebrations were a memory. The city was back to work. The maintenance crew finally returned to Building 12. It had been exactly 30 days since they cut the power. They were there to finally fix the glitch and turn the elevator back on. They stood on the 10th floor. The sign was still there. They engaged the manual override to open the doors. The steel doors slid apart, and the system was confronted with the magnitude of its failure. The scene inside was clinical, cold, and devastating. Wu's remains were found lying on the floor of the cab. The condition of the body told the entire story. She had clearly perished from starvation and dehydration. But it was the hands that haunted the first responders. Her hands were described as mangled. Her fingernails were gone. The walls of the elevator near the door gap were shredded with scratches. It was a scene of pure, concentrated survival instinct that had fought against an unmoving, uncaring machine. The police were called. The investigation began. But this was not a whodunit. The who was written on the work logs, the maintenance crew. The investigation was a wave of public outrage. The news broke on Chinese social media, Weibo, and quickly went global. The image of a woman trapped for a month in a modern high-rise during the biggest holiday of the year struck a primal nerve. It touched on a deep societal fear, the fear of being isolated in a crowded city. The fear of the bystander effect. The police arrested the 2 maintenance workers. They arrested the managers of the maintenance company. But arrests could not undo the 30 days. The bridge of this story is the realization of the timeline. When the police reconstructed the events, they realized the true horror. Wu did not perish immediately. She likely survived for a significant portion of that time. She was alive when the fireworks started. She was likely alive when they stopped. She was alive when the residents complained about the smell. She was right there, behind a thin sheet of steel. The discovery was not just finding a body. It was the discovery of a colossal, collective failure of empathy. The maintenance workers were charged with negligent homicide. But to understand this case, we must look beyond the legal charges. We must conduct a psychological autopsy on 2 entities, the victim and the system. Part A, Decoding the Victim, the psychology of the scratch. Why did she scratch the door? From a survival psychology perspective, this is a response to containment anxiety. When a human being is trapped, the brain shifts into a primal state. The rational brain, the prefrontal cortex, shuts down. The lizard brain, the amygdala, takes over. The lizard brain has one directive: escape. The scratching was not a logical attempt to cut through steel with fingernails. Wu knew that was impossible. The scratching was displacement activity. It was a way to channel the overwhelming adrenaline and terror. It was an attempt to do something in a situation where nothing could be done. It was also a marker. In her final days, as hallucinations and delirium set in from dehydration, The door became her entire world. Scratching it was a way of proving she still existed. Part B. Decoding the system. The psychology of fatal laziness. Now let's look at the workers. Why didn't they open the door on January 30th? They were not murderers in the intentional sense. They were victims of normalcy bias and the checkbox mentality. Normalcy bias. Elevators are usually empty. They had fixed hundreds of elevators. 99.9% of the time, when an elevator breaks, it is empty. Their brains filled in the blank with the normal assumption: it's empty. The holiday pressure. It was the day before the Lunar New Year. Their minds were already checked out. They were thinking about the train home, the dinner, the holiday. The task of checking the elevator became an obstacle to their holiday. The fatal shortcut. Shouting, "Is anyone there?" creates a psychological loophole. It allowed them to tell themselves, "We checked." It relieved them of the moral burden without requiring the physical effort of prying the doors open. This is the banality of evil. Evil is not always a man with a gun. Sometimes evil is a worker who wants to go home early. Sometimes evil is a company that doesn't enforce protocols. The why of this case is not malice. It is indifference. It is the terrifying reality that our safety often depends on the lowest bidder doing the bare minimum. And in this case, the bare minimum was a shout into the void. The aftermath of the Xi'an elevator case was a reckoning for the property management industry in China. The two maintenance workers were convicted. The property management company was fined. New regulations were passed requiring stricter checks on elevator maintenance. But for the residents of Building 12, the elevator became a tomb. Many moved away. Those who stayed reported walking past the doors with a shudder, unable to forget what had happened in that shaft. The reflection on this case is a somber one. It forces us to look at our own vertical cities. We live stacked on top of each other, separated by inches of concrete, yet we are often complete strangers. Wu lived in a building with hundreds of people, yet she died of loneliness. The haunting echo of this case is the silence. Not the silence of the elevator, but the silence of the outside. How many people walked past that door? How many people heard a faint scratching or a weak cry and dismissed it as pipes or wind? The tragedy of Zhang Weiyi is not just that she was trapped, it is that she was trapped in the middle of a crowd. The next time you step into an elevator and the doors slide shut, take a moment to listen. Listen to the hum of the machine. Listen to the silence. And remember that the difference between a convenience and a cage is just a power switch. In the year 2001, the internet was still a new frontier. It was a digital Wild West, a place of anonymity, where hidden communities could form and niche interests, no matter how dark, could be shared. But in a quiet town in Germany, a man posted an advertisement. It was not for a car or a roommate. It was a request, a fantasy so specific and so disturbing that most believed it was a sick joke. The ad was for someone willing to be slain and then consumed. The most terrifying part of this story is not that one man posted this ad. It is that another man answered. This is the case of Armin Meiwes, a story that is not a whodunit, but a whydunit of the most profound and complex order. It is a case that challenges our deepest understanding of motive, consent, and the dark, unexplored corners of the human psyche. This case is not about one man, but two. It is a story of two separate, isolated worlds running parallel, destined to collide. Our first normal world belongs to Armin Meiwes. He was, by all accounts, a ghost in his own life. He lived in Rothenburg, Germany, in a massive 44-room manor house that had once belonged to his family. But the house was not a home. It was a mausoleum. After his domineering mother passed away, Meiwes, a computer repair technician in his early 40s, lived there in total, suffocating isolation. He was polite, intelligent, and unremarkable to his neighbors. But behind this mask of normalcy, Meiwes was consumed by a private, lifelong fantasy, a desire to merge with another person, to make them a permanent part of him through the ultimate act of consumption. For decades, this was just a fantasy, fueled by books and later the internet. Our second normal world belongs to Bernd Jürgen Brandes. Brandes was, on the surface, Meiwes' opposite. He was a 43-year-old, high-level manager and engineer at Siemens, a major tech company in Berlin. He was successful, wealthy, and respected. But Brandes, too, lived a life of profound psychological isolation. He was haunted by his own dark fantasies, a desire that was the perfect, dark lock to Meiwes' key. He dreamed of being consumed, of being made a part of someone else, as a final act of self-annihilation. For years, these two men lived parallel lives, their impossible, opposing fantasies known only to them. Until the internet provided the bridge. This is the fracture. In 2001, Armin Meiwes, under the screen name Frankie, posted his advertisement on a niche online forum called The Cannibal Cafe. Hundreds of people saw it. Most were lurkers or fantasists. But one man, Bernd Brandes, saw it as an invitation. He replied. After exchanging emails, the two men agreed to meet. On March 9, 2001, Bernd Brandes, the successful engineer, packed a small overnight bag, went to the train station in Berlin, and took a one-way trip to Rothenburg. He was, in his mind, going to fulfill his life's ultimate, final desire. The fracture was complete. The two parallel worlds were about to merge in the most literal way imaginable. This is where the case leaves the realm of traditional true crime and enters a space of the truly surreal. When Bernd Brandes arrived at the train station, Armin Meiwes met him. They drove back to the 44-room manor house. This was not a blitz attack. It was not a con. It was a meeting. They spent the first few hours just talking, drinking coffee. Meiwes, needing to be certain, asked Brandes one final time, "Do you really want to do this?" Brandes confirmed. This was his wish. Meiwes then did something that would become the central, horrifying piece of evidence in the entire case. This is psychological seed number 2. He set up a video camera on a tripod. What followed, Meiwes documented in a 4-hour, clinical, and unflinching videotape. This is the forensic beat, but it is not a crime scene in the traditional sense. It is a procedure, one that both men had agreed to. The act began. It was, by all accounts, a macabre and surreal operation, with both men participating. Brandes, according to Meiwes, was a willing participant, even after the act had begun. This was not a frenzy. It was not an attack. It was a calm, methodical, step-by-step fulfillment of the fantasy they had both shared. The videotape is the proof. It documents in graphic detail the consensual nature of the act's beginning. After several hours, Brandes, weakened, was led to a slaughter room that Meiwes had prepared. It was there, hours after the procedure began, that Meiwes administered a final, fatal act, ending Brandes' life. This is the bridge, the tension release. The immediate physical act is over. The what has been established. Maiwes would later store the remains, consuming them over the next several months, fulfilling his lifelong pathological fantasy of merging. He was, in his mind, not alone anymore. He had recorded the entire act. He had documented his success. He was, he believed, a pioneer. And for nearly 10 months, he lived with his secret and his companion. He was so confident, so emboldened by his success, that he went back online. He was, allegedly, looking for his next volunteer. The unmasking of Armin Maivis was not the result of a brilliant police investigation. It was, like the crime itself, a product of the internet. In December 2002, nearly 2 years after the act, a college student in Austria was browsing the same Cannibal Cafe forums. He stumbled across a new post. It was from Frankie. The post was once again seeking a new volunteer. But this time, the post included graphic, detailed descriptions of what he had done to the last volunteer, as a way of proving he was serious. The student, horrified, alerted the German police. The police traced the IP address to the 44-room manor house in Rothenburg. When they arrived, they were expecting to find a fantasist, a troll. They knocked on the door, and the polite, mild-mannered Armin Maivis answered. When they questioned him, he did not lie. He did not deflect. He simply said, "Yes, I did it. He is no longer with us." He confessed to the entire act. He led the police to the freezer. And most importantly, he handed them the 4-hour videotape. The who and what were solved without question, but the how and why threw the entire German legal system into a psychological crisis. This is psychological seed number 3. Maiwes went on trial in 2003, and the central question was one that the 19th century German legal code had never anticipated. What do you charge a man with when the victim was a volunteer? The defense's argument was simple. This was not murder. Murder, known as Mord in German law, requires the act to be done for base motives, like hatred or financial gain. Maiwes, his lawyers argued, did not act out of hatred. He acted out of a shared pathological fantasy. They argued he should be charged with killing on request, Tötung auf Verlangen, a much lesser offense similar to assisting in a suicide, which carried a maximum sentence of only 5 years. The evidence, particularly the videotape, seemed to support this. It showed Brandis as a willing, cognitive participant in the act's beginning. The prosecution, however, argued that this was a psychological con. They argued that Brandis, despite his consent, was a deeply troubled man who was incapable of truly consenting to his own demise. They argued that Maiwes had manipulated Brandis, and that the ultimate motive, sexual gratification, was, in fact, the very definition of a base motive. The trial was a psychological spectacle. The court was forced to watch excerpts of the videotape. They listened to hours of testimony from Maiwes, who calmly and in graphic detail explained his fantasy. In 2004, the court compromised. They found him guilty, not of murder, but of the lesser charge of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 8.5 years. But the story does not end there. The German public and the higher courts were outraged. The case was appealed. In 2006, a new higher court re-evaluated the case. This time, they focused on the psychology. They ruled that consent to one's own demise, especially in such a pathological context, is legally irrelevant. They ruled that the act, regardless of Brandis's wishes, was morally repugnant and fulfilled the legal definition of base motives. The bridge was the final verdict. Armin Meiwes was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The legal question was finally settled, but the psychological one, the why, was now the only thing that mattered. The verdict was in. The trial was over, but the trial never truly answered the central question. Why? Not just why did Meiwes do it, but why did Brandis let him? To understand, we must conduct a psychological autopsy of both men. This is not the story of a predator and a victim. This is the story of a folie à deux, a madness of two. It is the story of a perfect, dark, psychological lock and key. The dossier, the making of Armin Meiwes, the lock. Let's apply the professor lens to Meiwes. His entire life was a case study in profound developmental trauma. The father wound. His father left when he was a young child. This created a void, a lifelong yearning for a masculine presence he could merge with. The engulfing mother. His mother was, by all accounts, controlling, overbearing, and manipulative. She forced him to sleep in her bed until he was a teenager. She sabotaged his relationships. She engulfed his identity. The fantasy. As a child, Meiwes was profoundly lonely. He had no friends, only imaginary ones. He read Hansel and Gretel. The fantasy of the witch eating the children became, in his mind, a fantasy of connection. His psychology was a contradiction. He feared being engulfed like his mother did, but he craved merging to fill the void his father left. His solution, his fantasy, was this: to consume another person, to literally, physically make them a part of him. This was, in his pathological mind, the only way to achieve connection without losing himself. He would be in control of the merger. He was not a sadist in the traditional sense. He did not get his thrill from pain. He got it from the fantasy of fusion. The dossier, the making of Burned Brandes. The key, B-plot. This is the B-plot. This is the USP. Meiwes' fantasy is meaningless without Brandes. Why would a successful, wealthy engineer volunteer for this? Because his psychological profile was the perfect dark mirror of Meiwes'. Brandis, too, was profoundly lonely. He, too, had a history of trauma. His fantasy, which he had also shared online, was one of self-annihilation. He did not just want to perish. He wanted to be erased. He wanted to be consumed. He, too, saw this as a final, profound merger. He was not a victim in the sense of being tricked. He was an active participant. He sought out Meiwes just as Meiwes sought him. Payoff Seed #1. The psychology of the phenomenon, the Internet. This folie à deux could only have happened in the modern era. For centuries, these two men would have lived and perished, their fantasies forever locked inside their own minds. They would never have found each other. The Internet acted as the catalyst. It was the dating service for the darkest, most niche pathologies. It allowed the key to find its lock. The ad was not just a seed, it was a sonar ping, sent out into the digital void, waiting for its perfect dark echo. Payoff Seed -2. The psychology of the videotape, the proof. This brings us to the tape. Why record it? From a profiler's perspective, this was not just a trophy, though it was that. It was proof of concept. For Meiwes, it was proof that his lifelong, impossible fantasy was real. It was his documentation. It was the script of his perfect act. For Brandes, the camera validated his fantasy. It ensured his annihilation would be seen, that it would be real. The videotape is the ultimate chilling proof of the consensual nature of this folie à deux. It is not a snuff film. It is a documentary of a shared pathological descent. This case is not the story of a monster and a victim. It is the story of two men, both monsters of their own trauma, whose fantasies tragically and horrifically aligned. The aftermath of the Meiwes case left a permanent scar on the legal and psychological landscape. The 44-room manor house in Rothenburg, the stage for this dark play, became a morbid tourist attraction. For years, people traveled to see the Cannibal House. In 2007, it was partially demolished by a fire and has since been torn down. And Armin Meiwes, in prison, provided one last baffling psychological twist. He became a vegetarian. This reflection is profound. In the structured, controlled environment of prison with therapy, his psychological need to merge seems to have abated. He has even expressed remorse, stating that his fantasy is now broken. The case of Armin Meiwes is a terrifying reflection on loneliness. It is a story of two men, both so profoundly, cripplingly isolated. Meiwes by his mother, Brandes by his own internal world, that they saw each other as the only solution. It is a case that forces us to ask, what is consent? And can a person, in the grip of their own profound pathology, truly consent to their own destruction? The haunting echo of this case is not the act itself. It is the advertisement. It is the fact that in the vast, anonymous darkness of the digital world, a question was asked, and the void answered. We have a fundamental, unspoken trust. It is the trust we place in our healers. When we are at our most vulnerable, on an operating table, we surrender our lives to the hands of a surgeon. We trust in their training, their oath, and their skill. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when the hands that are supposed to heal are, in fact, the hands of a predator? Tonight, we are not traveling to a dark alley or a remote cabin. We are traveling into the bright, sterile, and terrifying world of the operating room. This is the story of Dr. Christopher Dunch, a man who built a career on a promise to heal and left a trail of devastation in his wake. It is a case that asks one chilling question. Was he simply the world's worst surgeon, or was he a cold-blooded killer? The normal world of Dr. Christopher Dunch was, on paper, a portrait of brilliance. He was the triple threat of the medical world. He had an MD. He had a PhD in microbiology. He was a neurosurgeon, one of the most demanding and prestigious specialties in all of medicine. He had trained at the renowned University of Tennessee Health Science Center, a program known for producing some of the best surgeons in the country. He had published papers. He was involved in cutting-edge research. In 2011, he arrived in Dallas, Texas, like a conquering hero. He was charismatic, supremely confident, and armed with a resume that seemed to glitter. He was recruited by Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano, now Baylor Scott and White Medical Center Plano, a top-tier hospital. They gave him a massive salary, a startup package worth over $500,000, and the authority to build a world-class spine program. He was, to his patients, a miracle worker. He was the man who promised to end their chronic, debilitating back pain. His normal world was one of authority, brilliance, and trust. Our story, and the fracture of that world, begins with one of those trusting patients. Kelly Martin was a 54-year-old schoolteacher. She was suffering from chronic back pain from a previous fall. She had done her research. She found Dr. Dunch, this brilliant new surgeon at a prestigious hospital. He recommended a routine procedure, a simple microdiscectomy. She went in for this routine surgery, believing her pain would finally be over. The fracture of this case is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow, clinical, unfolding horror, hidden from the world by a sterile blue surgical drape. Inside the operating room, the staff who were there to assist Dr. Dunch began to realize something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. The surgery, which should have been straightforward, became chaotic. Dr. Dunch, according to the nurses, seemed disoriented and unfocused. He was allegedly operating in the wrong areas, his movements clumsy and destructive. At one point, he began cutting into the psoas muscle, a major muscle group which is nowhere near the surgical site. The team tried to warn him. He ignored them. And then he cut a major blood vessel. Kelly Martin began to bleed catastrophically on the operating table. The routine procedure had become a fight for her life. The staff watched in horror as their star surgeon seemed either unable or unwilling to stop the damage he was creating. Kelly Martin was rushed out of surgery, but it was too late. She had lost too much blood. She passed away in the intensive care unit. A healthy 54-year-old woman who had walked into a top-tier hospital for a routine back surgery was gone. The hospital was stunned. A death from such a simple procedure was a never event. It was an anomaly. But the hospital administration, looking into the case, was confronted with another, darker seed of information. This was psychological seed number 1. In his personal writings, in an email to an assistant just a short time later, Dr. Dunch would write a phrase that would come to define this entire case. He wrote that he was ready to become a cold-blooded killer. Was this a sick joke? A moment of narcissistic bracking? Or was it, in fact, a literal confession? The staff at Baylor Plano did not know. All they knew was that their star surgeon had just committed an inexplicable fatal error. They quietly and immediately suspended his privileges. The fracture was complete. The mask of the brilliant Dr. Dunch had slipped, revealing something chaotic and dangerous underneath. But the horror was just beginning. The death of Kelly Martin should have been the end of Christopher Dunch's career. It should have been a red flag so massive that it triggered a full-scale investigation by the hospital and the Texas Medical Board. It was not. This is where the why-done-it of Dunch's mind merges with the injustice of the system that enabled him. This is psychological seed number 2, the systemic failure. Baylor Plano did not fire Dr. Dunch. They did not report him to the National Practitioner Databank, a national database designed specifically to stop dangerous doctors from moving to new hospitals. Instead, they allowed him to quietly resign. They gave him a letter of good standing, stating only that there were no disciplinary actions against him. Why? In a word, liability. To fire him, to report him, would be to admit they had hired a dangerous surgeon. It would open them up to a massive lawsuit from Kelly Martin's family. It was, in their calculation, cheaper and safer to simply pass the problem on. And so, Dr. Christopher Dunch, a man who had just caused a patient's death through catastrophic basic errors, was released back into the Texas medical community. He was a predator, and the system had just let him go. He immediately applied for and received privileges at another hospital, Dallas Medical Center. The trail of devastation now accelerates. He is no longer just clumsy, he is destructive. Case file: Mary Efford. Mary Efford, 71, was a retired paralegal. She trusted Dr. Dunch to perform a spinal fusion. She awoke from the surgery in a state of horror. She was in 10 out of 10 agonizing pain, and she could not move her legs. When other surgeons, horrified, rushed her back into surgery, they found a scene of total devastation. The forensic beat of this case is not a crime scene. It is an X-ray. Dunch had, with what one doctor would later call unbelievable incompetence, drilled and hammered the surgical hardware completely into the wrong places. He had misplaced screws, drilling them through nerve roots instead of into bone. He had attempted to remove a disc in the wrong direction, colliding with the thecal sac, the bundle of nerves that controls the lower body. He had severed a critical nerve root and left it floating in the surgical cavity. He had, in effect, amputated the nerves that allowed Mary Efford to control her legs. She would never walk again. She was left permanently, agonizingly paralyzed from the waist down. Case file: Fluella Brown. Fluella Brown, 63, was a beloved grandmother. She went to Dunch for a routine cervical fusion. This is psychological seed number 3, the behavior. Inside the operating room, the staff at Dallas Medical Center watched the same chaos that the Baylor staff had seen. Dunch, they reported, seemed distracted, agitated, and confused. He was operating blindly, jamming instruments into the surgical site with excessive force. He began packing a surgical material called gel foam into the site, packing it harder and harder and harder. The neuromonitoring technician in the room, whose job it is to monitor the brain and spine, began shouting. The alarms were going off. The patient's vital signs were crashing. The staff screamed at Dunch to stop. He did not. He continued to pack the gel foam until, according to one witness, he had choked the vertebral artery, one of the main arteries that supplies blood to the brain. Fluella Brown had a massive stroke right there on the operating table. She was rendered comatose and would be taken off life support 2 days later. She was the second patient to pass away. Case file: Jeff Glidewell. Jeff Glidewell, a 64-year-old man, went in for what was supposed to be a simple, minimally invasive procedure on his neck. He awoke and could not speak. He could not swallow. He was choking. Dunch, in a routine procedure, had somehow, impossibly, punctured Glidewell's esophagus, his throat, from the inside of his spine. This is an error that, according to other surgeons, is anatomically impossible without extreme blind force. But Dunch did not report this. He stitched Glidewell up and left. Glidewell was left with a hole in his throat. Saliva, food, and bacteria began pouring from his esophagus directly into his chest cavity. He developed a massive, life-threatening infection. He was rushed back into surgery by other doctors who found a scene of pure butchery. Dunch had not just punctured his throat. He had, in the process, also sliced Glidewell's vertebral artery. He had stuffed a surgical sponge into the wound and just left it there. Jeff Glidewell would spend months in the ICU, fighting for his life, his body ravaged by sepsis. He survived, but as a shadow of his former self. This was the what. This was the trail. In just 2 years, in the sterile, brightly lit, and regulated hospitals of Dallas, Texas, Dr. Christopher Dunch had operated on 38 patients. 33 of them were left maimed, paralyzed, or deceased. He was not just a bad surgeon, he was a one-man army of devastation. The brick wall of the investigation was not a lack of evidence. The evidence was everywhere. It was in the paralyzed limbs of Mary Efford. It was in the graves of Kelly Martin and Floella Brown. The brick wall was the system itself. Dallas Medical Center, just like Baylor Plano, did the exact same thing. They did not report him. They did not fire him. They allowed him to quietly resign. He was, once again, passed on. He was free to apply for privileges at the next hospital. The what was a catastrophe, and the who was still walking the halls, wearing a white coat and carrying a scalpel. The hunt for Christopher Duntsch was not a whodunit. It was a how do we stop him dunnit. And the detectives, in this case, were not the police. The police were powerless. This was a medical matter, a civil issue, a case of malpractice. The hunt was taken up by the B-plot of our story, two fellow surgeons who saw the carnage firsthand. The detective, Dr. Robert Henderson. Dr. Henderson was a veteran, well-respected spine surgeon in Dallas. He was the man who was called in to try and salvage the surgery of Jeff Glidewell, the man with the punctured esophagus. When Dr. Henderson opened Glidewell up, he was expecting to find a complication. Instead, he found what he would later describe as a total disaster. He saw the sliced artery. He saw the hole in the throat. He saw the sponge that Duntsch had just left inside the man's neck. Henderson was first baffled. He thought this must be the work of an imposter, someone pretending to be a surgeon. He then reviewed Duntsch's other surgeries, including that of Mary Efford, the woman left in a wheelchair. His bafflement turned to cold, professional rage. He realized this was not incompetence. The errors were too extreme. He concluded that the only way to cause this much damage was to intend to. Dr. Henderson, a calm and methodical man, began his crusade. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He contacted the Texas Medical Board, the state's highest authority. He told them, in no uncertain terms, Dr. Duntsch is a sociopath. He must be stopped. The partner, Dr. Randall Kirby. Dr. Kirby was another Dallas surgeon, known for his outspoken, fiery personality. He was the bad cop to Henderson's good cop. He had been called in to assist Dr. Duntsch on a surgery before the full scope of his trail was known. Kirby watched live as Duntsch operated. He described it as an infant playing with surgical tools. He said Duntsch was lost, clueless, and dangerous. Kirby was so horrified, he physically stopped Duntsch mid-surgery and pushed him out of the way to take over the operation. Dr. Kirby, like Dr. Henderson, also began his own crusade. He, too, wrote letters to the Texas Medical Board. He called Duntsch a danger to the community. He called him a predator. The brick wall, the Texas Medical Board. This is where the hunt becomes the injustice. Doctors Henderson and Kirby, two of the top surgeons in the state, were screaming at the top of their lungs, "This man is a killer." And the Texas Medical Board did nothing. For months, they slow-walked the investigation. They lost paperwork. They reviewed the case. Why? Because the system is not designed to stop doctors quickly. It is designed to protect doctors from frivolous claims. The burden of proof was impossibly high. And Duntsch, the entire time, was still operating. He moved to a third and then a fourth surgical center. He continued to maim patients. Henderson and Kirby were in a state of professional and moral crisis. The system that they believed in, the one that was supposed to self-police, was failing. This is the bridge. This is the tension release of the hunt. After another patient was horribly maimed, Dr. Henderson realized the medical board was a lost cause. He and Kirby made a tactical decision. They bypassed the medical system and went to the legal system. They contacted the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. This single act changed history. They met with a prosecutor named Michelle Shugart. They laid out the files, the x-rays, the surgical reports, the paralyzed patients, the 2 deceased patients. They convinced Shugart that this was not malpractice. Malpractice is a mistake. It is an error in judgment. This, they argued, was intent. This was aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And the deadly weapon was his scalpel and his hands. The DA's office, in a historic and unprecedented move, agreed. The case was no longer a civil matter. It was now a criminal investigation. The hunt was finally over. The who was identified. The what was documented. Dr. Christopher Duntsch was arrested in 2015. The tension of the hunt was resolved. The physical threat was finally off the street. The bridge was crossed. The handcuffs were on. And now, the listeners, the survivors, and the B-plot, Henderson and Kirby, could finally ask the why. The verdict was in. The trial was over. The case was... Wait, no, the trial hadn't even begun. The who was in custody, but the why was the entire case. The Dallas DA, Story's office had to prove something that had never been proven in a U.S. courtroom, that a surgeon intended to harm his patients on the table. To do this, they had to conduct a psychological autopsy of Dr. Duntsch. They had to prove his mindset. The core question, was he incompetent or was he malevolent? The defense's argument was simple. He was just a bad surgeon, a tragic, clumsy, poorly trained doctor who was in over his head. Malpractice, they argued, is not a crime. But the prosecution, led by the evidence from Drs. Henderson and Kirby, argued for malice. Let's look at the dossier. The precision in the error. This is the key. Dr. Duntsch, Henderson, in his testimony, would argue that Duntsch's errors were not random. He said that to miss a surgical site by that much, to drill through a nerve root instead of bone, to puncture an esophagus, it required knowledge. He argued that Duntsch knew the anatomy. He had to. He was precisely hitting and destroying the things he was supposed to avoid. It was, in Henderson's view, intentional, surgical, evil. Payoff seed number 3, the OR behavior. Let's look at the mindset in the room. The staff testified that Duntsch was not panicked when things went wrong. He was agitated, arrogant, and dismissive of the alarms and the screams. This is not the behavior of an incompetent doctor who has just made a terrible mistake. A mistake leads to panic, to freezing, to asking for help. Duntsch's behavior was one of annoyance. The alarms were interrupting his work. This is the classic pathological narcissism. He is the star. The patient is just a prop in his show. Their vital signs are an inconvenience to his art. Payoff seed 1, the killer email. And this brings us to the dossier's smoking gun, the email to his assistant. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience and become a cold-blooded killer. The defense argued this was hyperbole, a joke from a stressed-out man. The prosecution argued it was a confession of intent. When you combine this email with the precision of his errors and the arrogance in his behavior, the psychological profile is not incompetence, it is a God complex. This is the mind of a man who believed he was a genius. He had the MD and the PhD. He was, in his mind, above the rules. And when the real world, his failed businesses, his messy personal life, did not reflect this genius, He took his rage, his narcissistic injury, into the one place where he had absolute power, the OR. He was not healing, he was punishing. He was destroying. He was, in his mind, a god, and the patients on his table were his to do with as he pleased. This is the second why. Why was he allowed to do this? This is where we analyze the psychology of the system. Payoff Seed 2, the quiet resignation. Why did Baylor Plano let him go? This is the psychology of liability aversion. A hospital is a business. A report to the National Practitioner Databank is a permanent black mark on the hospital's record. It is an admission of failure. It is a smoking gun for a lawsuit. A quiet resignation is clean. The problem goes away. The hospital's psychological need was not to protect the public. It was to protect the institution. They put their liability above their morality. The psychology of the Texas Medical Board. Why was the TMB so slow? This is the psychology of confirmation bias and bureaucratic inertia. The system is built on the presumption that doctors are healers. The default setting is to disbelieve a claim of intentional harm. It is unthinkable. Doctors Henderson and Kirby were fighting an idea. The board saw malpractice, a string of bad luck, a substance abuse problem. They could not see a sociopath. It took overwhelming evidence, dozens of maimed patients, to overcome this confirmation bias. The system is designed to catch bad apples, but it is not designed to catch poisonous trees. The why of this case is a folie à deux. It is the madness of two. It required the madness of one man, Dunch's pathological narcissism, and the madness of one system, the hospital's culture of silence. One could not have existed without the other. The A-plot of the system, finally and historically, converged in a Dallas courtroom in 2017. The prosecution, led by Michelle Shugart, did not charge Dunch with all 33 victims. That would be too complex. They focused on one, Mary Efford, the 71-year-old left in a wheelchair. Why? Because she was a survivor. She could testify. She could sit in her wheelchair in front of the jury and be the living embodiment of his deadly weapon. The B-plot, Doctors Henderson and Kirby, were the star witnesses. They, with cold surgical precision, narrated the story of the X-rays. They walked the jury through the butchery, explaining, doctor to civilian, why this was not a mistake. And the email, the cold-blooded killer line, was shown to the jury. The psychological autopsy was complete. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. They found Dr. Christopher Dunch guilty of injury to an elderly person, a first-degree felony. The bridge of justice was crossed. He was sentenced to life in prison. It was the first time in American history that a surgeon was criminally convicted for his actions in his own operating room. The reflection on this case is profound. The B-plot, the survivors, and the doctors had won. They had fought the system and the man, and they had, against all odds, achieved justice. But the haunting echo of this case is chilling. Dr. Dunch is in prison, but the system that allowed him to operate is still largely in place. The loopholes that allow hospitals to pass on dangerous doctors, the slow-moving bureaucracy of medical boards, the culture of silence that values liability over patient safety, those psychological flaws in the system still exist. Dr. Dunch was not a monster who emerged from the shadows. He was a monster who was created and protected by the very system that was designed to stop him. He was not an anomaly. He was a symptom. And that is a fracture in our normal world that is, perhaps, the most terrifying of all. This is the story of Graham Young, a man who, on the surface, was a polite, intelligent, and unremarkable coworker. But beneath that mask, he was a cold, clinical, and patient observer. A man with a God complex who viewed the people around him not as colleagues, but as lab rats. It is a case that asks one chilling question. What if the kindest person in your office is, in fact, a scientist, and you are their experiment? The year is 1971. We are in Bovingdon, a quiet village in Hertfordshire, England. Our normal world is the workplace of John Hadland Limited, a small, specialized factory that manufactures photographic and scientific instruments. It was a close-knit place. Everyone knew everyone. The work was precise, the atmosphere familiar. Into this normal world steps a new employee, 23-year-old Graham Young. He was, by all accounts, a model employee. He was hired as a storekeeper, handling the receiving and cataloging of supplies. He was quiet, polite, intelligent, and eager to please. He spoke with a scientific precision that impressed his bosses. And he had one notable, charming quirk. He was the office tea boy. He was always the first to offer to make a cuppa for his colleagues, bustling around, cheerfully taking orders and delivering the hot drinks to their desks. This normal world of tea rituals and quiet factory work continued for several months. And then, the fracture. It did not begin with a bang. It began with a stomachache. In the summer of 1971, a mysterious illness began to sweep through the Hadland factory. It was nicknamed, almost affectionately, the Bovingdon bug. It started with the factory foreman, Bob Agel, 59. He was suddenly and violently afflicted with agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. He was hospitalized, but doctors were baffled. They couldn't find a cause. He was sent home to recover. Then, just as Agel was returning to work, pale and weakened, another employee, Trevor Sparks, fell ill. Same symptoms: vomiting, excruciating pain, but this time something new, a creeping numbness in his fingers and toes. Then another employee, and another. The Bovington bug was now an epidemic. The factory was in a state of quiet panic. Was it the water? Was it a chemical leak from the storeroom? The B-plot of our story, the failure of the system, begins here. Management and local doctors were baffled. They assumed it was a particularly nasty, localized flu, or perhaps a contamination. And through it all, there was one constant, caring presence: Graham Young. This is psychological seed number 1. Young was the most caring of all. He seemed genuinely, almost academically concerned. He would visit his sick colleagues. He would ask them detailed, probing questions about their symptoms. Is the pain sharp or dull? When does the numbness begin? Is your hair falling out? And, most charitably of all, he was always there, ready to fetch them a comforting hot cup of tea. The fracture was now a pattern of illness, of mystery, and of the unflagging, cheerful kindness of the new storekeeper, Graham Young. The question was never, who is doing this? The question was, what is this bug? The Bovingdon bug was not a bug. It was an experiment, and Graham Young was the scientist. The scene in this case was not a place. It was the bodies of his colleagues. The forensic beat is a clinical description of human toxicology. Graham Young was not just serving tea, he was dosing. He was, with a cold, clinical precision, administering tiny, sublethal doses of a rare, odorless, and tasteless poison, thallium. Thallium is a perfect weapon for a patient predator. It is a slow poison. It mimics almost perfectly the symptoms of a severe gastrointestinal bug. And it has one unique, terrifying signature. It causes catastrophic nerve damage and, in the later stages, hair loss. Young was not trying to kill them, not at first. He was studying them. This is psychological seed number 2. The pattern of the bug was his research. He was, in his mind, a toxicologist, and his colleagues were his specimens. He would give a dose to Bob Agel. He would watch and take notes. He would give a dose to Trevor Sparks. He would watch and take notes. He would later write, fascinated by the interesting effects. But the Bovingdon bug was about to escalate from academic curiosity to fatal outcome. The what? The case of Bob Agel. Bob Agel, the 59-year-old foreman, was the first to get sick. He was also the first to recover. But after he returned to work, Young, apparently, found this recovery to be unsatisfactory. He began dosing Agel again. Egel's symptoms returned, this time with a vengeance. The cramps, the pain, and then a creeping paralysis that started in his feet and worked its way up his body. He was rushed back to the hospital. Doctors were, again, baffled. They treated him for Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder. They had no reason to suspect poison. On July 19, 1971, after weeks of agonizing pain, Bob Agel's body finally gave out. He perished from pneumonia, a secondary complication of the paralysis that had ravaged his body. His death was officially ruled complications from an unknown virus. The Bovington bug had claimed its first victim. And at the factory, Graham Young was, by all accounts, distraught. He organized a collection for Agel's widow. He was the model of a grieving colleague. No one suspected a thing. The escalation, the case of Fred Biggs. The experiment now had a fatality. A normal mind would be horrified. It would stop. Graham Young's mind was emboldened. He now turned his curiosity to a new specimen, Fred Biggs, 56, another man who worked in the stores. In the fall of 1971, Fred Biggs suddenly and violently fell ill. The forensic beat here is, again, a litany of symptoms. The pain, the vomiting, and then the signature that should have blown the case wide open. Fred Biggs's hair began to fall out, in clumps. He was admitted to the hospital. Doctors, this time, were suspicious. This was not a bug. This looked, for all the world, like thallium poisoning. But how? Why? Where? Fred Biggs lay in his hospital bed, his body shutting down, his nerves on fire. He was in so much pain, he begged the nurses to end his life. On November 19, 1971, Fred Biggs perished. His death was a brick wall for the doctors. They knew it was poisoning, but they had no who and no why. The Hadland factory was now officially a sick building. 2 men had perished from a mystery illness. Others, like Trevor Sparks, were suffering from long-term, debilitating nerve damage. The what was a catastrophe, but the who was still patiently making the tea. The hunt for the who was not a whodunit in the traditional sense. There was no detective. The hunt was, at first, a medical investigation. After the death of Fred Biggs, the company was forced to act. They brought in a specialist, Dr. Ian Anderson, to investigate the Bovingdon bug. Dr. Anderson began interviewing the staff. He spoke to the survivors, like Trevor Sparks, who was now suffering from permanent nerve damage. He reviewed the autopsies of Bob Agel and Fred Biggs. He too came to the thallium conclusion. This was not a bug, this was poison. But who? Dr. Anderson was baffled. This was a factory of scientific instrument makers, not assassins. And then he had a consultation with one of the employees, Graham Young. This is the bridge. This is the unmasking. And it is one of the most chilling, narcissistic unmaskings in criminal history. Graham Young, the polite storekeeper, volunteered to help Dr. Anderson with his investigation. And Young, in his arrogance, overplayed his hand. He began to show off. He asked Dr. Anderson, "Doctor, have you considered thallium poisoning?" Anderson was stunned. Thallium was an obscure, rare poison. Why would a storekeeper know that? Young continued. He began with academic precision to debate Dr. Anderson on the symptoms. He suggested that the symptoms of the Bovingdon bug were not consistent with thallium. He suggested that they might also be consistent with antimony or arsenic. Dr. Anderson was no longer baffled. He was horrified. He was not talking to a storekeeper. He was talking to a toxicologist. A toxicologist who had a God complex and could not resist the urge to prove he was the smartest man in the room. Dr. Anderson immediately and quietly left the factory. He called Scotland Yard. He told them, "I believe you have a poisoner at the Hadland factory, and I believe his name is Graham Young." The police, now armed with a who, began their hunt. They ran a background check on Graham Young, and what they found was psychological seed number 3. This was not Graham Young's first epidemic. The police discovered that Graham Young was, in fact, a graduate of Broadmoor Hospital, the UK's most high-security psychiatric facility. He had been committed there at age 14 for poisoning his entire family. This is the B plot, the systemic failure. The police, now realizing they were dealing with a known assailant, raided Young's apartment. They did not find subtle clues. They found a poisoner's lair. They found vials of thallium. They found antimony. They found arsenic. And they found the diary. This was the smoking gun. It was a cold, meticulous, scientific ledger of his experiment. He had dosed over 70 people. He noted the doses he gave. He noted the clinical effects. Entry on Bob Eagle. Eagle is improving. I will have to increase the dose. It is a shame to have to use him, but I must have a guinea pig. Entry on Fred Biggs. Fred is now a textbook case. He is in agonizing pain. Hair loss is now apparent. Entry on his success. I have in my hands the power of life and death over these foolish, stupid men. This was the confession. This was the why. The tension release was the trial. Graham Young was arrested. The trial was a formality. The diary was read aloud to a stunned courtroom. Young's defense? He claimed the diary was a fantasy, a work of fiction. The jury did not believe him. They saw the fiction in the paralyzed bodies of the survivors. They saw it in the obituaries of Agel and Biggs. He was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison. The bridge was crossed. The what and who were solved. But the haunting echo of the trial was psychological seed number 3. How? How did a 14-year-old family poisoner get cured and released just to do it all again? The why of this case is not just about Graham Young. It is about Broadmoor. The verdict was in. The trial was over. But the trial of Graham Young only answered what he did at the Bovingdon factory. It did not answer the central question, why? And, more importantly, how was he allowed to? This is our USP. To understand, we must conduct a psychological autopsy of both Graham Young and the system that failed to see him. This is a why done it type B and an injustice type C fused together. Part A. The dossier. The making of Graham Young, Phase 1. Let's rewind to 1961. Graham Young is 14 years old, living in Neasden, a suburb of London. He is not a normal 14-year-old. He is a prodigy. But his talent is poison. The dossier. He is obsessed with toxicology. He is obsessed with dark figures. Adolf Hitler, Dr. Crippen, an infamous poisoner. The fantasy. He does not want friends. He wants power. He sees poison as the invisible hand of God. It is clean, intellectual, and powerful. The experiment, Phase 1. He begins dosing his family. He puts antimony in his father's food. His father becomes violently ill. He puts it in his sister's food. She too is crippled with pain. His family is confused. They are sick. Graham, the caring son, brings them tea. His experiment culminates in 1962 with his stepmother, Molly Young. He gives her dose after dose after dose. He observes her clinically as she withers. She develops paralysis. She is in agony. She finally perishes. At her funeral, Graham is reportedly fascinated by the effect of her passing. This Phase 1 ends when Young's school chemistry teacher becomes suspicious. He finds poisons and diaries in Young's desk. The police are called. At 14, Graham Young confesses. He admits to poisoning his father, his sister, and a friend. He does not confess to slaying his stepmother. Her death at the time was ruled natural causes. The system is now faced with a monster, a 14-year-old sociopath, as the psychiatrist at the trial calls him. He is not sent to prison. He is sent to Broadmoor Hospital indefinitely. He is patient number 2955. Part B. The Injustice. The B-plot payoff, Phase 2. This is payoff seed number 3. How was he cured? The answer is, he wasn't. He conned them. For 9 years, Graham Young, the patient, played his greatest role. He performed normalcy. He read the psychiatrists. He told them what they wanted to hear. He renounced his interest in poison. He showed remorse. He weaponized their arrogance. The system, the B-plot, is itself narcissistic. It needs to cure people. It needs to succeed. Graham Young gave them the success they craved. He never stopped experimenting. This is the chilling part. While at Broadmoor, he continued his studies. He grew cyanide from laurel bush leaves. He dosed other patients. He dosed staff members. One inmate, John Burridge, perished suddenly in 1970. Young, it is now believed, tested his homemade cyanide on him. The system saw none of this. They saw only the polite, intelligent, cured young man. In 1971, his doctors went before a judge. They declared patient 2955 a total success. They stated in official records that Graham Young was no longer a danger to himself or to others. They stated he was fully cured. He was released. 9 years of study, 9 years of practice. The system had not cured a sociopath. It had trained him. It had perfected him. And then it unleashed him. Part C. The motive. The God Complex Payoff Phase 3. This brings us back to Bovingdon. Why did he do it? This is the psychological autopsy of his motive. Payoff Seed 1. The T-Boy. Why was he so caring? This was the signature of his God complex. The T was his delivery system. It was intimate. It was trusted. His caring behavior was the thrill. He was the angel and the devil in the same act. He was God, giving the T and taking the life. Payoff Seed 2. The Bottington Bug. The motive was not slaying. The motive was observation. Graham Young was, in his mind, a scientist. He was a genius, surrounded by fools. He did not hate Bob Eagle or Fred Biggs. He was indifferent to them. They were specimens. The diary is the proof. It is not an angry rant. It is a lab notebook. He was, he believed, conducting important research. The power he felt was not rage. It was intellectual superiority. His why was the ultimate pathological narcissism. He was invisible. He was all-powerful. He could play God, making his colleagues sick, better, or perish, all with a stir of a teaspoon. And he almost got away with it, if not for his own God complex, the arrogance that forced him to show off to Dr. Anderson. The A-plot of the system, which had failed so catastrophically in 1971, finally succeeded in 1972. Graham Young was returned to the system, not as a patient, but as a convict. He was sent to Parkhurst Prison, a maximum security facility. He was, to the end, a celebrity in the prison. He was the teacup poisoner. He loved the infamy. His reflection on his life? He reportedly told other inmates, "My only failure was that I was caught." The B-plot, the system that had cured him, was left in ruins. The Broadmoor scandal forced a complete overhaul of psychiatric release protocols in the UK. The injustice of his release was, in its own way, rectified. But the human cost was permanent. Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs were gone. Trevor Sparks and dozens of others were left with a lifetime of pain and nerve damage. The haunting echo of this case is the diary. It is the cold, clinical proof that the human mind is capable of a detachment so profound that it can view life and death as a hobby. In 1990, Graham Young was found in his cell. He had passed away from a heart attack at age 42. But to those who knew him, the detectives, the survivors, it was not that simple. The official cause was natural. But the unofficial theory, the one that rhymes with his entire life, is that Graham Young, the master of his own domain, had, in one final, controlled act of science, dosed himself. He had, in his mind, published his final experiment. We often think of Italy as a land of light. We think of the golden sun of Tuscany, the art of the Renaissance, the rolling vineyards, and the ancient sun-baked stones of history. It is a landscape designed for romance, for beauty, and for life. But for nearly 20 years, beneath that golden glow, a shadow moved. It was a shadow that turned the romantic hills of Florence into a landscape of terror. It was a shadow that did not just hunt, it performed a ritual. Tonight, we travel to the winding country roads of Tuscany to investigate the most infamous, complex, and terrifying cold case in Italian history. This is the story of Il Mostro, the monster of Florence. The story of the monster does not begin with the monster. It begins with a crime that, for years, was believed to be a simple, tragic act of jealousy. The year is 1968. The setting is Signa, a small town just outside of Florence. It is the night of August 21st. The summer air is warm and heavy. In a small, secluded lane near a cemetery, a white Alfa Romeo Giulietta is parked in the dark. Inside the car are two lovers, Barbara Locci, a 32-year-old woman known locally for her beauty and her complex love life, and her companion, Antonio Lobianco, a 29-year-old bricklayer. But they are not alone. Asleep in the back seat is Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino. The fracture happens in the silence of that lane. A figure approaches the car. 8 shots are fired. The weapon is a Beretta .22 caliber pistol loaded with Winchester Series H ammunition. This specific combination, the gun and the copper-jacketed bullets, is the forensic fingerprint that will haunt Italy for decades. Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco are slain instantly. But the 6-year-old boy, Natalino, is physically unharmed. What happens next is the subject of nightmare and debate. The boy, Natalino, wakes up in the dark car, surrounded by silence. He eventually gets out. He walks nearly 2 kilometers in the dark, alone, to a nearby farmhouse. He knocks on the door and says, "Open the door. I am sleepy. I have my daddy in bed. My mummy and uncle are dead in the car." The police investigation is swift. It focuses immediately on the most obvious suspect, Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele. Stefano Mele is a Sardinian immigrant, a man described as simple, jealous, and humiliated by his wife's affairs. The police interrogate him. At first he denies it, then he confesses, then he retracts, then he blames his lovers. Finally, the system accepts his confession. It fits the narrative perfectly. It is a delitto d'onore, a crime of honor. A jealous husband slaying his unfaithful wife and her lover. Stefano Mele is convicted. He goes to prison. The case is closed. The Beretta .22 is never found, but the police assume Mele threw it away. The file is shelved. The hills of Florence return to peace. Or so they thought. This crime, the 1968 murder, was supposed to be the end, but in reality, it was only the prologue. Because 6 years later, while Stefano Mele was sitting securely in a prison cell, the gun woke up. For 6 years, the darkness slept. Then, on the night of September 14th, 1974, the fracture reopened. Pasquale Gentilcore, 19, and Stefania Pettini, 18, were parked in a Fiat 127 on a dirt road in the Mugello Valley, north of Florence. They were young, in love, and seeking privacy. The next morning, a farmer found their car. The scene was a mirror image of 1968. They had been shot. The police collected the shell casings. They sent them to the lab, and the ballistics report came back with a result that was, scientifically, impossible. The markings on the casings were identical to the 1968 case. It was the same Beretta .22. It was the same Winchester Series H ammunition. This is the moment the system fractured. If Stefano Mele was in prison for the 1968 murder, how could the gun be here, 6 years later, killing again? Had they imprisoned the wrong man, or had the gun been passed on? But in 1974, the police did not connect the dots immediately. They treated it as a separate incident. The monster waited another 7 years. In 1981, the spree truly began, and this time it brought with it a new, terrifying psychological seed. The escalation, 1981 to 1985. June 1981. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio are slain near Scandicci. October 1981. Stefano Baldi and Susanna Combi are slain near Calenzano. June 1982. Paolo Magnardi and Antonella Migliorini. September 1983. Wilhelm Meyer and Jens Rusch, 2 German tourists likely mistaken for a couple. July 1984. Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini. September 1985. The final double murder of Jean-Michel Crevetuelai and Nadine Moriat. 8 double murders, 16 victims. But it wasn't just the death count that terrified Italy, it was the ritual. Starting in 1981, the killer began to do something unthinkable. This is psychological seed number 2. After shooting the couple, the assailant would drag the female victim out of the car. He would then use a sharp instrument, a knife or a scalpel, to perform a surgical, ritualistic excision. He would remove the victim's pubic area. In later cases, he also removed the left breast. We must analyze this through the profiler lens. This is not frenzy. This is precision. The excisions were done quickly, in the dark, often in under 10 minutes, yet they were done with a steady hand. This suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, or at least experience with butchery or hunting. This behavior transforms the crime from a lust murder into something far more complex. This is a fetishistic trophy hunt. The killer was not killing for the act alone. He was killing to harvest. He was taking a piece of the victim with him. This signature tells us about his psychology. Depersonalization. He did not see the women as people. He saw them as vessels that contained the object he desired. Sexual inadequacy. Profilers theorized the killer was likely impotent or unable to have normal relationships. The trophy was his way of possessing the female without the threat of interaction. The Beretta obsession. The fact that he never changed his gun, despite knowing the police were looking for it, suggests the gun itself was a totem. It was part of the ritual. He could not kill without that specific gun. The hills of Florence were now a forbidden zone. The B-plot, the panic of the community, reached a fever pitch. Young couples stopped going out at night. The lovers' lanes were empty. The monster had not just killed 16 people. He had killed the romance of an entire region. And the police were chasing ghosts. The investigation into the monster of Florence is a case study in systemic failure, type C. It was driven by panic, politics, and a desperate need to find a scapegoat. Theory 1. The Sardinian clan, the vendetta. The police first looked back at the 1968 murder. Since the gun was the same, the killer had to be connected to Stefano Mele. They developed the theory of the Sardinian clan. They believed the gun had been passed around a family of Sardinian immigrants like a communal weapon. They arrested Stefano Mele's brother, Francesco Vinci. Then, they arrested other relatives. They held them in prison. And while they were in prison, the monster struck again. The theory collapsed. The system had imprisoned innocent men, while the real killer walked free. Theory 2. The Lone Wolf, Pietro Pacciani. In the late 1980s, under immense pressure, the police created a computer algorithm to search for suspects. It spat out a name, Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani seemed like the perfect monster. He was a robust, angry, 60-year-old peasant farmer. He had a history of violence. He had killed a man in 1951 for sleeping with his girlfriend. He was known as Il Vampa, the Flame, for his fiery temper. He was abusive to his daughters. He fit the brute profile. The police became obsessed with him. This is psychological seed number 3, confirmation bias. They searched his house. They found a sketchbook with sexual drawings. They found a generic bullet casing, not fired, in his garden. They built a case entirely on character assassination. They argued that Pacciani was a sexual sadist who hunted couples out of rage. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted. The city of Florence breathed a sigh of relief. The monster was caught. But the profilers were not convinced. Pacciani was a violent, crude man. But was he the surgical killer? Was he the cold, methodical shadow who struck with military precision? It didn't fit. Pacciani was hot rage. The monster was cold ritual. Theory 3. The Picnic Friends, Compagni di Merende. Then the case took a turn into the absurd. An acquittal overturned Pacciani's conviction. The police, desperate to keep their theory alive, pivoted. They claimed Pacciani wasn't alone. They claimed he was the leader of a group of older, voyeuristic men, the so-called Picnic Friends, Compagni di Merende. They arrested 2 of Pacciani's friends, Mario Vanni, a local postman, and Giancarlo Lotti, a local drunk. Lotti, under intense interrogation, confessed. He claimed they all went out together to kill. He claimed they sold the trophies, the excised body parts, to a mysterious doctor for black magic rituals. This confession saved the police's case, but it strained credulity. Were we really to believe that a group of bumbling geriatric alcoholics were the surgical, phantom-like monster of Florence? In the end, Pacciani died of natural causes before his final retrial. Vanni and Lotti were convicted. The system declared the case closed. But the gun, the Beretta 22, was never found. The trophies were never found. And the mystery remained. The courts were satisfied, but the mind rebels. The Picnic Friends solution feels like a bandage over a gaping wound. To truly understand the monster, we must ignore the system's panic and return to the evidence. We must apply the FBI agent lens to the psychology of the ritual. Analysis 1. Decoding the gun, the totem. Why use the same gun for 17 years? A rational killer would have tossed the Beretta after the first or second crime. It was the only link connecting the murders. The fact that he kept it tells us the gun was not just a tool. It was a totem. Psychologically, the gun represented his potency. This aligns with the theory of sexual impotence. The gun was his phallus. It was the instrument of his power. To throw it away would be to castrate himself. He needed that specific gun to complete the fantasy. This suggests a rigid, obsessive personality type, someone who follows a strict internal script. Analysis 2. Decoding the ritual. The excision. Why the mutilation? This is the darkest part of the profile. This was not sadism, inflicting pain. The victims were usually dead before the mutilation began. This was necrophilia and fetishism. The killer was taking the source of the female power. By removing the pubic area and later the breast, he was reducing the woman to an object. He was harvesting her sexuality to possess it. This points to a loner, someone who is socially invisible, someone who cannot interact with women in the real world, so he must create a scenario where they are passive and he is in total control. It contradicts the picnic friends theory. These acts are deeply private, shameful, and solitary. They are not group activities done by drunk friends for money. Analysis 3. Decoding the systemic failure, the panic. Why did the police fail? This is the psychology of panic. The system could not handle the idea of a lone, intelligent psychopath. In Italy, in the 1980s, crime was usually mafia or political terrorism. It was organized. The idea of a serial killer, a term that didn't even exist in Italian law at the time, was alien. So they tried to force the serial killer peg into the organized crime hole. They looked for a clan. They looked for a group. They looked for a doctor hiring hitmen. They looked for a conspiracy, because a conspiracy is understandable. A single, invisible man hunting for his own dark pleasure was too terrifying to contemplate. The final profile. We are not looking for a Sardinian clan. We are not looking for drunk friends. We are looking for a single male. He is local. He knows the back roads of Tuscany intimately. He is intelligent and cunning. He avoided police roadblocks for 17 years. He has anatomical knowledge, doctor, butcher, hunter. He is a solitary collector. He is a man who likely watched the investigation with amusement, a man who stood in the shadows, holding his totem, watching the system tear itself apart, while he kept his secrets and his trophies safe. The vineyards of Tuscany are quiet now. The lovers' lanes have returned to the lovers. But the shadow remains. The Monster of Florence case is officially closed by the convictions of Vanni and Lottie. But in the court of public opinion and in the minds of experts, it remains a gaping void. The gun, the Beretta .22, is still out there. It is rusting in a river, or buried in a garden, or perhaps sitting in a drawer, a silent witness to 16 lives stolen. The reflection on this case is a sobering one. It reminds us that justice and truth are not always the same thing. The system found someone to blame. It found a monster it could understand, the brutish Pacciani, but it likely missed the real monster. The monster who was smart, the monster who was surgical, the monster who stopped simply because he chose to. Today, Florence is a city of art and light. But if you drive into the hills at night and you park on a quiet, dark lane, you can still feel the echo of the fear that ruled this place for 20 years. The haunting echo is not a sound. It is an absence. The absence of the gun, the absence of the truth, and the terrifying possibility that the monster of Florence lived out his days, silent and invisible, watching the sunset over the hills he had stained with blood. And so, with the final, whispered confession of a broken narcissist, our first anthology on the psychological turning point comes to a close. The files are now closed. The analysis is complete. The why has been explored. And now the world outside fades away. The only mystery left is rest. It is time to let the darkness be a comfort, and to let your mind be still. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Good night and sleep well, sleepy detectives.